We'll discuss about the hemoglobin and transport of the oxygen. The adult hemoglobin consists of the four polypeptide chain, 2 alpha and 2 beta, and each chain contain heme portion which has iron in reduced form. This iron is responsible for the binding of O2. Basically, this is also binding site for the carbon monoxide. Basically, the carbon monoxide competes with the binding site with oxygen. When this ferrous form of heme is oxidized into the ferric form, which is ferric form is present in the hemoglobin. This ferric form has decreased affinity for O2 and increased affinity for cyanide. Second thing, this beta globin chain is also responsible for 2,3 BPG binding, and when beta chain bind with 2,3 BPG, which lead to the unloading of O2, which cause increased delivery of O2 to the peripheral tissue. Adult hemoglobin increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood 70-fold, while oxygenated blood is more affinity for O2, and deoxygenated blood as deoxygenated hemoglobin blood has decreased affinity for O2, mean increased delivery of blood. Decreased affinity, when increased affinity of O2 blood mean more O2 binding to the hemoglobin, and affinity of oxygenated hemoglobin is 300 times. Second thing is a fetal hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin is a consist of the 2 alpha chains and 2 gamma chains. 2 gamma chains has decreased affinity for 2,3 BPG, while 2 beta chain, which is present in the adult hemoglobin, has an increased affinity of the 2,3 BPG. When 2 gamma chains has decreased affinity for 2 BPG, then it lead to the increased affinity for O2, and this thing help in the transport of the oxygen from mother to fetus. Oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve has a sigmoidal shape due to the positive cooperativity binding of the O2 molecules to the hemoglobin. Positive cooperativity is defined when one molecule of O2 bound to the hemoglobin, it increases the affinity of the second molecule of the O2. Now look at the curve of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. This is the normal curve of the hemoglobin, which is sigmoidal in shape. Basically, this is the arterial pressure of the oxygen, and this is the venous pressure of the oxygen, which is a 40, and this is 100 millimeter of mercury. At 100 millimeter of mercury of the oxygen pressure, hemoglobin is 100% saturated with oxygen, and at 40 millimeter of mercury pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin is almost 70% is saturated with O2. And second is the terminology is P50. What is a P50? P50 is the pressure at which the 50% of the hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. The normal P50 is a 20 or 25 millimeter pressure of the millimeter pressure of the oxygen. Let move toward the right and left shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So right shift of oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves mean Decrease affinity of hemoglobin to the oxygen means increase O2 unloading to tissue, means in peripheral tissue where is the oxygen demand is increased. So that's why hemoglobin curve shift toward the right. For example, when we exercise, the tissue metabolism is increased, carbon dioxide concentration is increased, which ultimately lead to the increased concentration of the hydrogen ion and which ultimately lead to the acidosis. So these changes lead to the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve towards the right side. Basically, in the look at that, the curve in right shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, the P50 is increased. It means more oxygen pressure is needed to achieve the hemoglobin 50% saturated with oxygen. Second thing is 13-BPG. Basically, it is a adaptive response from high altitude when we move from the plain areas to the mountain areas. This 2,3-BPG concentration is increased, as we know that these 2,3-BPG bind with the beta chain of the hemoglobin and shift the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve toward the right. And last thing is the temperature also causes the right shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Let's discuss the left shift of the oxygen hemoglobin. Left shift of oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves, it is exactly opposite to the right shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. In right shift, decrease affinity of the hemoglobin to the oxygen, where in the left shift increase affinity of the hemoglobin to the oxygen, and P50 is reduced in left shift. Second thing is Bohr effect and the Haldane effect. These two effects are the super high yield for the USMLE and the FCPS exam. Basically, the Bohr effect takes place in peripheral tissue, while Haldane effect takes place in the lungs. So, increased hydrogen ion concentration in the peripheral tissue lead to the increased O2 unloading from the hemoglobin and increase O2 delivery to the peripheral tissue. Second is Haldane effect is the take place in the lungs. Basically, it's a dissociation of the hemoglobin from the dissociation of the hydrogen ion from the hemoglobin, which cause increased CO2 released from the RBC. So Bohr effect and Haldane effect are the high yield stuff for the USMLE. Oxygen content of the blood. Oxygen content of the blood is defined as amount of the O2 which is bound form and which is in a dissolved form. Basically, the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin is bound form of the oxygen, where the dissolved oxygen, which exert the partial pressure of the oxygen, it is the free form of the oxygen which is not bound to the anything like hemoglobin. Second are the condition in which the oxygen content may affect and may remain normal. First condition is the carbon monoxide poisoning. As we discussed, the carbon monoxide poisoning, in which the carbon monoxide basically bound to the ferrous ion of the heme portion, and in which hemoglobin concentration remains normal, but oxygen saturation, basically which is the binding of the oxygen to the hemoglobin, is decreased, and dissolved oxygen, which is the free form of the oxygen, remain same. So total O2 content of the blood is decreased because of the decrease in the bound form of the hemoglobin, or bound from the oxygen in the form of the hemoglobin. Second condition is anemia. Anemia is basically the decreased production of the RBC, which lead to the decreased concentration of the hemoglobin. So in this case, the only thing change, which is hemoglobin concentration, as well the total O2 content. So free form of the oxygen remains unchanged, and O2 saturation is also remain unchanged. Third condition is the polycythemia. Polycythemia is basically the increased RBC production, which lead to the increased hemoglobin concentration. So in this condition, hemoglobin concentration and total O2 content, oxygen content of the blood is increased. Methemoglobinemia, in which the ferrous form is oxidized to the ferric form, which has a decreased affinity with the oxygen, has increased affinity to cyanide. So in this condition, bound form the oxygen is decreased, so total O2 content of oxygen is also decreased. Last condition is the cyanide toxicity. Cyanide toxicity, in which all the four parameters remain same, but two things in the common in the cyanide was carbon monoxide poisoning. Both inhibit the aerobic metabolism and also inhibit the complex 4 of the electron transport chain.